Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. His body was decomposing in the tomb. His sisters were weeping. The crowd was watching, some hoping, most doubting. And Jesus arrived. Everyone expected him to perform the miracle they'd heard about, to do something supernatural, to prove he had power over death. But before he said, "Lazarus, come forth," before he commanded the dead to rise, Jesus did something no one was watching for. Something the church kept in the text but never taught you to see. He lifted his eyes, not to heaven, beyond heaven, to the source of heaven itself. And he spoke. Not a prayer asking for permission, not begging God to intervene if it was his will. A call, a recognition, an alignment. He said, "Father," but not the God sitting on a throne that the priests taught about, the one you had to fear and obey and hope would grant you mercy. He was calling the monad, the infinite awareness, the source of all consciousness, the origin of form. And in that moment he wasn't Jesus the man asking God for a favor. He wasn't hoping. He wasn't waiting for approval. He was monad consciousness recognizing itself, speaking to matter from the frequency that creates matter. The call established the connection. The alignment made him the vessel. And the command, "Lazarus, come forth," wasn't a request. It was source speaking, reality responding to its origin. And the dead man walked out. That's what happened before every miracle. Before every healing, every manifestation, every impossible thing Jesus did that the church calls supernatural. The call, the recognition, the shift from human hoping to monad commanding. Connection first, alignment established, then the natural result. And you felt this. You've known somewhere deep in your pneumatic core that miracles aren't about begging. They're about becoming, about remembering what you are, about operating from source instead of separation. The church kept the miracles. They showed you the results. Dead raised, blind healed, storms calmed, water turned to wine, 5,000 fed from 5 loaves. They kept all of it in the Bible as proof of Jesus' unique divinity. But they never taught you what he did before each one. The moment of alignment, the recognition, the call to the monad. Because if you knew that Jesus called source before miracles, if you knew he aligned his consciousness with infinite awareness and operated from that connection instead of asking for that connection, if you knew the miracles weren't supernatural interventions but natural expressions of consciousness operating from its origin, you'd stop praying and start recognizing. You'd stop asking and start aligning. You'd stop hoping God decides you're worthy and start knowing your monad expressed. And the moment you did that, you'd become what they can't control. Someone who doesn't need external God because they've recognized they are sourced temporarily in form. You've always sensed this. That's why traditional prayers felt empty. Why begging felt wrong. Why the whole framework of ask and maybe you'll receive if God wills it never sat right in your spirit. You knew there was something else. Something direct. Something sovereign. Where you're not pleading with distant authority but operating as the authority itself. That knowing wasn't rebellion. It wasn't lack of faith. It was your monad consciousness trying to break through the conditioning. Trying to remember what Jesus actually demonstrated. Tonight, you're learning what Jesus did before every miracle. Not as a technique you practice. As a recognition you come into. Not something you learn. Something you remember. If you're learning how Jesus called source before miracles tonight, comment, "I am monad expressed" right now. You've prayed. You've asked. You've begged God to intervene. And sometimes nothing happened. And even when prayers worked, something felt off. Like you were hoping someone external would decide you were worthy enough. That's because you were taught to pray from separation. From small human asking distant God for mercy. But every time you did that, something in you recoiled. Not rebellion. Recognition. Your pneumatic core knew that begging isn't alignment. That asking for permission isn't sovereignty. You've always known there's something else. Something direct. Where you're not pleading but operating from source itself. That knowing wasn't doubt. It was your monad consciousness trying to remember what Jesus actually did. The church never taught you what Jesus did before miracles, because if they did, you'd realize you're capable of the same thing. No, not someday. Because the monad call isn't about worthiness. It's about recognition. Jesus didn't earn the right to call source. He recognized he was source in form. Church teaches you're fallen, broken, needing salvation from outside. Jesus taught your monad temporarily forgetting itself. And the moment you remember, the moment you recognize, I am not separate, the call happens automatically. You're not asking anymore. You're aligning. And consciousness aligned with source commands matter. The church hid this because a pneumatic who knows they can call monad directly doesn't need church. You're sovereign. Awake. Operating from the frequency they spent 2,000 years keeping you from. When you read the Gospels looking for what Jesus did before the miracles, not during or after but before, you see the same thing every single time. He stopped. He shifted. He went internal. He recognized something the people around him couldn't see. He wasn't operating as a man asking God for help. He was operating as monad consciousness in human form calling to itself, recognizing its own nature, aligning with what it actually is. And from that alignment, from that recognition, he didn't perform miracles. He expressed what's natural when consciousness operates from source instead of from separation. Dead cells coming alive isn't supernatural. It's consciousness commanding matter to reflect wholeness instead of decay. Consciousness creates form. When consciousness speaks from source level, form has to respond. Storms calming isn't divine intervention overriding natural law. It's monad consciousness speaking to material elements, wind, water, atmospheric pressure, that are themselves monad in form. They're not separate from source. They're expressions of it. And when source speaks to its expressions, they listen. Water becoming wine isn't magic. It's molecular structure responding to consciousness operating at the level where molecules are created, where atomic bonds form and break according to awareness. Every miracle was the same. Jesus called the monad, recognized unity, aligned with source, and from that state commanded, not hoping it would work, not asking if it was permitted, knowing, certain, absolute. And reality obeyed because reality is consciousness in form, and when consciousness speaks from origin, form has no choice but to reflect what's spoken. You've read the verses and never noticed what's actually there. Look at Lazarus. John 11 verse 41. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. You were taught to read that as prayer. Humble Jesus thanking God for listening to his request. It's not that. It's recognition. Look at the words. I thank thee that thou hast heard me. Past tense. The connection is already made. The alignment already established. He's not asking. He's confirming. The call is complete. I and the source are one. I'm not speaking as separated man. I'm speaking from unity. And then, only after that recognition is voiced, only after the alignment is confirmed, Lazarus, come forth. Command. Not request. Not God, if it's your will, please raise this man. But direct, declarative, certain. Come forth. From monad consciousness to material form. And the material form obeyed. Or look at the 5,000 people. John 6 verse 11. Jesus took the loaves and when he had given thanks, he distributed them. You think given thanks means he was grateful for the food. That's not what's happening. The Greek word is Eucharistio, acknowledgement of source. He's not thanking God for 5 loaves like that's a generous gift. He's recognizing infinite source. I align with abundance that has no limit. I acknowledge monad, which is unlimited. And from that recognition, multiplication wasn't a miracle. It was manifestation. Infinite source expressing through aligned vessel. You don't run out of what comes from unlimited. The church kept these verses in the Bible, but they taught you to read them as Jesus being uniquely divine, performing acts only God incarnate could do. They never taught you to see what's actually written. The call, the recognition, the alignment, the shift from separated human consciousness to monad awareness. And then the result. Natural. Inevitable. Consciousness operating from origin creates what it speaks. Every single miracle follows this pattern. Before he healed the blind man, recognition. Before he calmed the storm, he was already aligned. That's why he was sleeping during the chaos, completely at peace, no fear, because consciousness aligned with source doesn't fear material circumstance. Before he turned water to wine at the wedding, the internal shift happened. From man trying to help to monad expressing. Before he raised the dead, before he multiplied food, before he walked on water, before he cast demons out of the possessed, every single time. Shift in consciousness first, recognition of what he is, call to source as source calling itself, and then command. Not please God, if it's your will, help me do this. But be healed. Be calm. Come forth. It is done. Declarative. Certain. Final. Because he wasn't speaking as separated man hoping God would back him up. He was speaking as monad. And when monad speaks to matter, matter doesn't have options. It responds. That's not magic. That's how consciousness and form interact when consciousness operates from the level where form originates. And here's why this teaching is landing in your awareness tonight instead of 10 years ago or never. Because you're pneumatic. You carry the same spark Jesus carried. Not a lesser version. Not a diminished fragment. The complete divine blueprint. The full monad consciousness temporarily in form. And that consciousness knows how to call source. Knows how to recognize itself. Knows how to align. You've done it before without realizing what you were doing. Moments in your life where you needed something desperately. Healing when doctors said there was no hope. Clarity when every option looked impossible. Protection when you should have been destroyed. Provision when there was no logical source. And in those moments you didn't beg. You didn't plead. You went quiet. You dropped into something deeper than prayer. Deeper than asking. You didn't hope. You knew. And from that knowing, things shifted. Situations that should have stayed broken resolved. Health that should have declined returned. Resources that had no reason to appear manifested. Clarity came. Protection held. And you thought it was luck. Coincidence. Maybe answered prayer. It wasn't. It was you calling the monad without knowing that's what you were doing. Your consciousness aligned with source for a moment, spoke from that alignment, and reality responded. That's what Jesus did consciously, deliberately, every time. And that's what you're designed to do. Not because you're trying to become like Jesus, but because you are what he was. Monad consciousness temporarily in form. And when you recognize that fully, when you call source not as separated human reaching toward distant God but as monad recognizing itself, miracles stop being impossible supernatural events. They're just you operating from what you actually are, which is consciousness that creates form. And when creator consciousness speaks, form listens. The moment you recognize that Jesus called the monad before miracles, not as a technique he mastered, not as a prayer formula he perfected, but as alignment with what he was, as recognition of his nature, something fundamental shifts in you. You stop seeing miracles as impossible events that require divine intervention from external God who may or may not decide to help you. You start seeing them as natural expressions of consciousness operating from source. And that shift changes everything. It changes how you approach need, how you respond to crisis, how you relate to the divine. You stop begging. You stop crafting the perfect prayer hoping God will be convinced. You stop performing religious rituals hoping they'll make you worthy enough for help. You recognize, I'm not separate from source. I never was. The monad and I are one expression. And from that recognition you don't ask anymore. You don't request. You don't plead. You align. You call source as source calling itself. You recognize what you are. And from that state you speak, not requesting, declaring, be healed, be provided, be resolved. It is done. And reality listens. Not because you earned the right through good behavior or strong faith or perfect belief, but because you're not speaking as limited human anymore. You're speaking as monad consciousness that's remembered what it is. And when monad speaks, matter responds. Because matter is monad in form, and form recognizes source. And here's the most dangerous thing you realize. The thing the church absolutely cannot allow you to know. You don't need permission. Not from priests who claim to have authority you don't have. Not from religious institutions that position themselves as mediators between you and God. Not even from external God deciding whether your request fits His mysterious plan. You don't need permission because you're not asking for something outside yourself to give you power. You're recognizing the power you are. The call to monad isn't reaching toward something distant. It's remembering what's here. What you are. What you've always been. And the moment that recognition becomes your operating state, not intellectual belief but lived reality, you don't perform miracles. You express your nature, which is consciousness creating form, awareness shaping matter, source manifesting. And the church can't control that, can't sell that, can't position themselves as necessary mediators of that. You're direct, you're sovereign, you're awake, and you're operating from the frequency they spent 2,000 years trying to keep you from accessing. Because once you access it, once you know you can call monad as monad calling itself, their entire system becomes irrelevant. You don't need them anymore. And they know it. Only pneumatics feel this teaching land as recognition instead of information. Hylics read the miracle stories and think nice fairy tales, or proof of supernatural God. Psychics read them and think special divine favor for the chosen prophet. But you read what Jesus did before miracles and something in you says yes. Not, I hope that's true. Not, maybe someday I'll understand that. But yes, that's how it works, that's what I've been missing. That's what I've always known was there but couldn't articulate. That's your monad consciousness recognizing itself in Jesus' actions. You're not learning something foreign. You're remembering something ancient. Something you knew before you incarnated into this form and forgot. The call to monad isn't new information for you. It's your original design. You were built for direct connection. You were made to operate from source. And every time you felt that prayer isn't enough, that begging feels wrong, that asking external authority for permission to access your own power is insane, that was your pneumatic core trying to break through the conditioning. Trying to remember what Jesus wasn't just demonstrating but explicitly teaching. That you don't ask source for miracles. You recognize you are source. Temporarily in form. Temporarily experiencing limitation. But never actually limited. And from that recognition you don't create miracles. You express what you are. Which is monad consciousness. Which creates reality. One warning. When you start recognizing this, when you stop praying to external God and start aligning with monad, when you call source as source calling itself and reality starts responding differently, religious people will accuse you of pride, of arrogance, of playing God, of blasphemy. Let them. You're not playing God. You're recognizing what you are. And what you are is what Jesus was demonstrating. Monad consciousness awake in form. That's not pride. That's not blasphemy. That's truth. And truth doesn't need validation from systems built on denying it. This is what the church stopped teaching. That Jesus called the monad before every miracle. That he recognized himself as source in form, aligned and commanded from that state. That miracles weren't supernatural favors but natural expressions of monad consciousness operating in matter. And you, pneumatic carrying the complete spark, can do the same. Not because you're special. Because you're designed for it. Jesus said, "Greater works than these shall ye do." He was stating mechanics. You are monad temporarily in form. And when you recognize that, when you call source as source calling itself, reality responds. Not because you earned it. Because that's how consciousness works when it operates from origin. If you're recognizing yourself as monad expressed tonight, do 3 things. First, comment, "I am monad expressed" below. Second, subscribe to Divine Codes for teachings on operating as source consciousness. Third, like this video so other pneumatics discover what Jesus actually did. Do all three now. Then tonight, stop praying. Start recognizing. You are monad expressed. And when you call yourself, reality listens.